I generally, once every 2 years, I teach this course to psychology students and AI students, or like this year, only to AI students. And I usually juggle it around a bit, right? The psychology students have a bit of a different background generally. And so I tailor things a bit every year. If you feel like for your background, things are going a bit like slowly, as I should be faster on the technical side of things, feel free to say this, right? Just send me a message and say like, the level was this and that, right? Because I tend to have to titrate this a bit. And if you're like, you know, I don't think this will be the case, but if you're like, could you explain some technical background a bit more deeply? I'm also very willing to do that, right? So that's just a bit about where the course comes from, right? And what I want to be in this course is just as flexible as possible, right? So that if you have any topics also that you find interesting that we aren't actually aiming for during the course, I can always, you know, come up with a lecture near the end, things like that. I tend to have this thing, yeah. So I recognize a bunch of faces from brain imaging, which is cool, because, well, then I have memory. So the, this doesn't work, let me, yay. So let me just introduce myself. So many of you that know me from brain imaging already know who I am. And yeah, maybe even some of the, like one of the TAs. So I'm Thomas. I work both here at the VU, at the Cognitive Psychology Department, and at the Spinoza Center for Neuroimaging. So I do a lot of brain scanning, and that's why I teach the brain imaging course. And I also do a lot of computational modeling, but in both locations, really. And that's why I teach this course. So I have a bit of a more technical background relative to most of the psychology people. So I really feel like a sort of AI person, even though I haven't actually studied AI, but studied physics way back. So where will these lectures be? Keep an eye on the announcements, right? We're going to have to play it by ear a bit. I think we'll end up in this lecture or 1-2 floors down mostly. So I'll try to keep that steady. But yeah, my apologies for that being so haphazard. So next to lectures, I'm holding office hours, which means that if you have any question that you want to ask me personally, you can log into the office hours Zoom, which is on the syllabus, in the syllabus. If you have any questions about topics, anything that you feel I need to address in the lectures or anything like that, the office hours, you can always sort of break in. I'll be at my desk waiting for people to log in and cry when they don't. Yeah. If you want to contact me through email, send it to this Gmail address. And you can say that you're like in the subject, you're in the neural models class, but I don't have any other concurrent classes, so that should be fine. Yeah, during these times of year, I just check this email all the time, so I should be able to pick up on your questions immediately. And we have a bunch of practicals. I'll go into the topics for those. And for both those practicals and the reading materials that we'll read online, Ron and Chiffon will be supervising or co-supervising those parts of the course. Yeah, so if you end up having a question and it doesn't get answered by me, this is not like the Russian mafia having hacked my account. This is Ron and Chiffon that are helping me TA in the course. Yeah. So the contents for this course are that I'll be lecturing a bunch like this. Yeah. So we'll just be talking. I'll try to keep this very interactive. We also have 2 practical assignments. We'll create Canvas discussions for specific help on the practicals, and we'll have 3 meetings during which we can have like hands-on interactions to help you go through the practicals. I'll talk a bit more about what the content of the practicals is later on here. So welcome. Yeah, so lectures on top of that, practical assignments. And at the second half of the course, what we'll be doing is we'll be focusing a lot on specific topics that I hope I've given you some background about. So things like, I don't know, like brain-computer interfaces, the interface between memory and perception, like specific subjects that you'll be listening to podcasts about. And then the idea is that you create a presentation about those podcasts that you've been listening. Yeah. And then as a backbone throughout the course, like every week, 1 or 2 papers, you'll read those. And we'll do that on Perusall. Have you done that before? It can be a bit annoying, but it is very helpful if you have any questions. We're going to try to keep really on top of the Perusall reading. So Stefan and Ron are going to really be checking the Perusall questions every day to be able to update you with any, if anything is unclear in the papers. Yeah. So those are the ingredients of the course. That's what the material is all about. Now, one important thing I need to say is that this is a bit of a, nightmare in terms of arrangement, in terms of time planning, but I will be at a scientific conference in a couple of weeks, which means that I'm going to miss a few lectures. And this also means that for 3 lectures in a row, you won't be required to come here for a physical lecture. I have pre-recorded these lectures, so there won't be any sort of hole in the program in terms of topics. And things like the reading materials will keep going on as usual. And my plan is to give you a tour of the conference when I come back. So I'm going to keep an eye out, like what new research actually, slots in line with what the course is all about. And then I hope to be able to give you like a half a lecture on the really cool things that I've seen happen. So I'll be back on the 18th. This means 3 lectures. Yeah, you can already see the lectures, so you won't be missing anything. I hope to be able to just add something to the course as a result of me visiting that conference. Yeah. So about the lectures, you've maybe seen this weird thing where we have 2 lectures a week at the start of the course, and then it sort of becomes less at the end when we're going to devote more time to practicals and these presentations for the podcasts. The idea is that in the first couple of weeks, we'll be able to go through the basics. So we'll have 2 lectures a week. And then later in the course, I'll be talking less and letting you guys do more of the talking, right, in terms of these presentations. And I'm hoping that we can have like a very interactive second half of the course as a result. Yeah. Now, in terms of topics, what we're going to do is start out with models of behavior, right? Cognition, very important part of that is just the behavior that we perform. So very basic models of explaining how people behave, simple actions, if you will. And then we'll move to neural network models that many of you will be intimately familiar with and see how those are models of the brain and how the brain is a model of neural network models. How do these 2 interface, these 2 different fields of AI and neuroscience? And that's really the goal. So I'm just going through each of these topics, right? Each of the different types of learning that we'll go through. Next is literature. So the idea is that we'll read about 7 articles in Perusall. 7 might feel like a lot, but they're spaced out relatively widely. You'll also have to read 1 or 2 papers once you've chosen a podcast. So there's some reading involved. So many of you have used Perusall, right? If not all of you, yeah. So I tend to do this thing when I read a PDF on my computer. I tend to click every paragraph that I'm reading, which you shouldn't do because Perusall will think that you're going to comment on that paragraph. If you have something to say about each paragraph, that's great, but don't do that. What's really nice though is it can have this very nice interactive thing going on inside Perusall. You can find the papers. I think I've already uploaded most of the papers already, and most of the first half of the course in terms of the assignments. So you can start reading now. That's all already set in stone. And whenever something pops up, like a new paper that's being published in the literature, and I find that that would be a really nice support for a given lecture, then I'll give it to you too. Which all means that this is relatively fragmented in terms of topics, in terms of materials. We don't have a book. So if you have any questions about what turns out to be exam materials and what not, I'll try to be as clear as possible, and we can, I'll also answer any question about that. So this podcast presentations thing, I really like, because once you have some background on what the field is about, you can start to listen to these podcasts and really see how specific researchers think about their own research in light of other research too. So the format of this podcast is, in most cases, this Paul Milbrooks, who's a researcher himself, or used to be a researcher himself, and he interviews AI and neuroscience researchers about recent work that they've done. So this gives you this really nice sort of colloquial format in which they talk about state-of-the-art research. Each of these episodes, they talk about a specific piece of work, and usually that's a scientific paper. So you can also read the papers behind these podcasts. Now, the idea is that with a small group, depending on how many people there are, I have to see how many groups fit into the lectures that we have. The idea is that with a group, you single out one of the episodes that you want to discuss, that you find most interesting, and then create a presentation about that specific piece of research and that specific podcast episode. Yeah, and that in the final lectures, you'll present those presentations. Yeah. So this gives you a way of really focusing on a topic that you find interesting. That's the idea. Yeah. Cool. Now, we do two practicals. I've sort of blended multiple practicals together. The first treats behavior, and the other one is more a theoretical neuroscience sort of thing. So this first half of the course that I was talking about, where we talk about behavior, that's also reflected in the first practical. And then after that, we go more into like models of neurons and that sort of thing. Yeah. Now we're running all this on Google Colaboratory, so I'm just hosting these on my GitHub and link to them. You can open them, save them on your Google Drive, and then just run the notebook. Yeah. It's not graded or anything like that. We're not going to go through all of your answers and checking whether they're all correct. It actually gives all the answers. It's really meant as a sort of support for the things that we do in the lectures, just to give you a more intuitive feel for the different things that we do. Yeah. And so it's all Python based. If you want to do like a programming exercise sort of thing to get you up to speed with Python, which I don't think is that relevant for this group, we have a tutorial for that too, right? So you can start doing that if you feel like you want to have more background. Now, about your grade, always very important. Much of the topics that we'll discuss are going to be just reflected in the exam. So most of the grade that you get is going to be based on the exam. And it covers the course materials, like the PDFs that you're also supposed to read on Perusall. And I'll give you an example exam, and we'll have a question hour at the end of the course, so that it's clear what I'm expecting of you. Now then, Perusall tracks your literature reading, yeah, and it says here 10% of your grade is going to be reflected by this Perusall. What this means is I'm mostly going to treat this as a bonus, right? If you are one of the people that are very active in leading discussions and in discussing things and asking questions on Perusall, this will have a beneficial impact on your grade. Yeah. Now, 20% of your grade is more of a group grade. that's given by this podcast episode that you'll be presenting in the final lectures. Is that clear? So I'm hoping that we'll have a course where you learn a bunch of theory and are able to choose the topic that you find interesting and really participate in this. So you get a real feel for what the research is all about. That's really my goal, that you get an idea of what the topics are in this field and how are you going to, like, if you want to do a career in this sort of field, what's really your specific interest. Yeah. So any questions about the specifics of the course? Mm-hmm. No, it should be, you should be able to, yeah, tag along just fine. Yeah. Well, I'm not going to talk about many brain imaging things specifically. Mm-hmm. No, that's perfect. Yeah. So like I said, like around the third week or so, I'll be giving a very brief intro in artificial neural networks, like backprop and that sort of thing. Mostly there for the psychology students to get a bit of a feel for what's going on. So that's probably going to be like, okay, right? But I'm going to show you how that relates to what people think brains are doing, for example, right? So yeah, in that sense. But I don't think you'll have any problems following what's going on. Yeah. Any other questions? Oh, really? Oh, well, I'll update the link. Yeah, so the second is a duplicate of the first or something.
No, the first is the
That's weird.
but if,
I'll fix it.
I mean, the name says it's fine, but it takes to a link.
So you've already gone through the entire list. Oh, wow, excellent. Nice. I'll fix the link so that no one else has to go through that. Thanks. Yeah, so about my tradition is to have like 70% of the exam be multiple choice. And then I have a few like these more creative types of questions where you have to like resort lists and you know fill in blanks and that sort of thing. And then usually I have bonus questions. Like those of you that have done brain imaging, you get bonus questions about like pretty far out there, more essay type questions. Yeah. So that's the idea. Any other questions? Great. So all of this information is online, right? There, the PDFs of the lectures of today are also, you can find them on Canvas. They're in the files section. I hope you've seen. So I'll start. I'll go on to the next part of the course, or like lecture, sub-lecture, if you will. And that's this. I'll make sure that we have a break in like 15 minutes if I'm not finished with this. Yeah. So this whole course is about how you use computational models to explain what the brain does. Yeah. And with what the brain does, I mean cognition. Yeah? So what we experience in our heads, how does the computer that's our brains create this experience, right? That's really the goal to understand. And we're going to try to address that question or sort of attack that issue using a specific set of tools, namely computational models. Now, many of these computational models, they have a lot of similarities to techniques that we use in AI, which makes this a really, really cool blend between neuroscience and AI. So I hope you'll get a feel for that. In this specific sub-lecture, I'll be talking a bit about why we would want to use computational models as scientific tools. Yeah? So this isn't about, you know, AI modeling or deep neural networks. It's really about how computational models, mathematical tools can help us understand things in scientific practice. So, like I said, the goal is really to try to understand the mind and how the brain produces the human mind. Right? And if you look at this quote from Al Newell, who's a very old AI pioneer, he says, like, we know that the underlying principles of how the world works are physics. Yeah, and still, we understand that biology is built on top of that, but we have this sort of very ephemeral thing that we experience, right? The mind. And it sort of makes sense that it should arise also from these physical and biological principles. But the question is, how does it do that, right? How can biology and physics produce something that we live every day? And the way that I want to teach you how to think about this issue is really as follows. We have these two different fields historically. One being neuroscience, where people really like measure neurons, like cells in animals, for example. There's lots of different techniques with which we can measure electrical activations of cells or see what proteins they express, how groups of neurons fire together, that sort of thing. There's a lot of measurement going on. So you have oodles of data, right? What this is these are physical measurements, right? Electrical measurements, mass measurements, that sort of thing. So you have enormous amounts of data, and this is like a really, really big jug of all sorts of scientific results, but they're really, really hard to interpret because this field has all this data, but it is relatively theory poor. Yeah? There aren't any overarching physical laws of nature, if you will, for how brains work, or at least we haven't found them yet. We just have a lot of measurements. Yeah? Now, on the other hand, you have like cognitive science historically and psychology, which as a field has been using these sort of models like this. So this is a model of working memory. Cognitive science is really interested in the human mind, like how does the human mind work? But it's usually been restricted to things like behavioral measurements. So it's relatively data poor, so specifically like in relation to neuroscience. Yeah? And what that also means is the focus in psychology has been a lot on theories, just like this model of working memory that you see there. So people have had these long-standing debates about, oh, this is top down or this is bottom up, where, you know, it's still pretty semantic. And the thing is here, I'm calling this semantic because what this field lacks is these mechanistic explanations of what's going on, right? You see this sort of box diagram here. It's not really representative of a mechanism. Yeah? So it doesn't have this sort of mechanistic underpinning. So both of these fields are really, really productive, and we've learned a lot from them, but something is missing in both. And what is missing is we need to sort of bridge this gap between the two, right? And the way to do that is to take these principles from physical sciences, namely computational models, mathematical models that describe what the mechanisms are that are at play in a specific measurement, so that we can create really like hardcore scientific theories of how the mind works. This would solve problems in terms of the data richness of neuroscience, right? So having a more comprehensive theory that can describe all of these different results. And it would also supersede all of these box diagrams that we know from psychology. Yeah? So this is really an aim to take this study of the mind into natural sciences. Yeah? And the tool that we need to do that is computational models. And that's really what this course is about, trying to understand how the brain works, how the mind works, using these models. But it's hard to do this. This requires a lot of work. So there's a few different ways in which we tend to think about this study of the mind. I'll go through a few of these different ways of thinking about how to address this problem. Why are we using models? How should we think about what we're trying to do in this field? Yeah. Now, the first is, it was very well put in a book by David Marr. This book, Vision, was published in 1980. He tragically died 1 or 2 years after he published this book. So he had cancer. He was like one of the major stars in the field, and he would have like won a Nobel Prize or something, people would say. But he died very young, and so all we have is this book. So you can see that he's a big scientist from just the impact that this single book had on the field. So what this book does, it describes how you would construct these computational models of how we see. Yeah? So that's why it's called Vision. And he also takes a step back and says, okay, but if we want to understand how the mind works, what are our levels of description? Right? How can I articulate how should we be looking at this problem? And he voiced these three different levels at which we can attack this mind-body problem, trying to make these computational models, computational explanations of how the mind works. So the first is the more high-level description level is that of computation. And that is really to describe the problem that an organism is trying to solve in a specific arena at a very high computational level, yeah, very abstract. Like the agent is trying to optimize reward rate in this environment, that sort of thing, right? And then try to build a model of that sort of description, yeah? Now then is the algorithmic level. Like, okay, if I now understand this abstract problem that the brain should be solving, I think, how would it implement it in terms of the code or pseudocode that I would need to write for the organism to implement it? Yeah. So that's the algorithmic level. What is the algorithm that the organism uses to solve this problem? And you can imagine that if you have a given computational problem, you can solve it at the algorithmic level with many different types of algorithms. Yeah? So you have a bunch of choices there. And all of these give a rich expression of how we can approach a problem. Yeah? Now, the third level is really the implementation level. Like if I were to measure electrical currents in a neuron, right, how could the electrical currents that I'm measuring now reflect the computation that happens? Yeah? And now you see that these things are a bit intermixed, right? So if you're measuring from a neuron, you're thinking a bit about, well, is this the if statement in my algorithm, that sort of thing, right? You sort of looked up a bit, right? And you can also think about, this neuron is now participating in a computation at this abstract level. But you need to be, the point here is that you want to be aware of the level of description that you're trying to aim for. Yeah? Because a neuron is a very local measurement. It's going to be implementation level. Yeah. And so to make this huge jump from the neuron to the computational level, this very high abstract level, that you cannot really do. Yeah. So when we think about the things that we're trying to do with a computational model, we have to keep in the backs of our minds, what is the level that I'm trying to attack this problem at? Yeah. This is one way of thinking about it, right? You can have these very grandiose models, very abstract, or you can have very, very fine-grained models, very, very concrete models. So you can also see this sort of gradient of levels as a gradient of going from very abstract to very concrete. Yeah? And we're here saying traditionally that there are 3 levels. There aren't 3 levels. Didn't mean to like completely destroy what I just said, but it's important to realize that this is just a more or less arbitrary distinction, and it fits really neatly. Yeah? And you'll see in one of the papers that we're going to read a very nice metaphor, right? So the computational level is I want to fly, right? Then the algorithmic level is I'm going to push air down, right? And then the implementational level can be, okay, now I'm going to build a jet engine and just push the air down because I'm going really fast and I have steady fixed wings. Or I can implement it as a bird and say, I'm going to grow feathers and you just flap around my wings, push air down that way, and I'll also be able to fly, right? So you see this sort of gradient between the different levels there, but it's not an absolute distinction, right? In many cases, you're somewhere in between. You're somewhere in between the algorithmic level and the implementation level. And the more important thing is that you realize where you are, yeah? So what am I trying to do? So am I trying to understand this at an abstract level or a more concrete level? Now, the major tool that we'll be using is models. They say that models are tools. These may be tools, but not in the right sense, right? These are models. In some way, they're models the way that I intend to use the concept here, right? They are simplified descriptions of the real world, perhaps, or simplified reflections of the real world. But this isn't really the type of model that we're interested in. So you have other types of models like this, which is also like a simplified version of the real world thing that you're interested in. But this is just a miniature, right? But the specific type of model that we're interested in here is that of the scientific model, right? So what I'm showing you here is the Rutherford model of the atom, right? Where you have a nucleus in the center and the electrons are orbiting around it, yeah? This representation, we all know because we saw it in like grade school or high school, right? That we first encountered this really, really early on. So it's a really big part of how we know that the world around us works. But 130 years ago, people had no clue. Yeah? So we as humans had to come up with this model as a tool to better understand the structure of the world around us, right? And the idea is that we do exactly the same thing when we want to understand our own minds. Yeah? That's why we want to use models. Okay, let's have a small break. I could do with a coffee. Shall we be back here in like 8 to 10 minutes or so? And we'll take it from there. Yeah.
Sorry, teacher, there is no sound.
How about now? Can you hear me now? I can see the microphone going green. Jeez Louise, that was weird. Okay, I'll put those things away and I'll shout to the computer when I speak. So yeah. So the things that you may have learned in psychology, they're very much these verbal theories. All right, they're not very explicit mathematical or mechanical models. They're very much, verbal theories. And so the way that psychology has evolved as a field is to have these verbal semantic statements and then test that hypothesis, right? So this fits really neatly statistically into a hypothesis testing framework. And it's clear from the way that this has evolved that this leaves a lot to be desired. It creates artificial sort of binary distinctions, right, that may not be really relevant. And it leaves researchers with a lot of freedom to not be completely open and thereby do things like keep testing while adding data or while leaving out data to see whether your p-value, right, this sort of very important thing, if your p-value is low enough, you can claim something. I'm not going into the statistics here, but this sort of practice of having this threshold of statistical significance with this binary hypothesis testing has played a role in this. And so one thing that we're going to focus on in the start of this course, when we're talking about how can we explain behavior, really is like, can we care less about the words in the theories, but focus more on the mechanisms, right? And like you saw just before, right? If we can create these mechanisms in a computer, then we can have a completely different type of test of the thing that we're interested in. So this forces us again, like similar to what I just said, forces us to be very specific about the hypothesis, right? You can't just mince words around it, right? There's no way out. If you've created a clear prediction based on a model, you can't say, oh, but I really meant something different and you didn't understand my word, attention or consciousness or memory the way that I actually meant to use it, because you've made it so much more concrete. And so it moves in terms of statistics, it also moves us from a hypothesis testing framework to a prediction and replication type of framework. Now, these concepts may be a bit vague right now, but we'll go into what these differences mean when we try to put our models into practice. So one really cool thing that you can do is then create multiple models. You know these, this BBC show, Robo Wars, right? There's this arena and people have their remote controlled robots and the job of these robots is to demolish one another, right? So it's a very geeky, totally weird thing. But this is what we do with our models. We put them into an arena, namely explain the data, and then we can compare how different models match up.
this model explains the data better than this model. Yeah, and you really have a very beautiful sort of strict arena in which you can test your theories. That's the idea. Okay. Now, how can models help specifically? Right, models can play a lot of different roles. And I just want to highlight how not only models can be a really good sort of tool for science and allows us to be strict in just the right way and all those things that we'll go into when we start fitting models to behavior and that sort of thing. But models are a very beautiful sort of intellectual tool to wield as a scientist and as a student. Specifically also because it allows us to test our understanding. Right? It has this inherent bar in it. If I can simulate something, if I can recreate something, I understand it. Right? It means that if you fail at this, it means you don't understand it. And then that means that it gives you a tool also to understand how you don't understand it. So how can these models be a tool for increasing our understanding? Yeah. So one thing is that when you create a model, for example, there's a class of models that explains how perception works when perception is has two different alternatives. So you may know these. This is just very ad hoc, but let's say maybe I'm going a bit too far with this example, but you'll have to just say it after the course. So when I draw this, right, you can see this as a cube. It goes one way. If you stare at it for long enough, it goes another way also, right? I hope I drew it correctly. Yeah? So you have this ongoing back and forth in your mind, right? It's as if these two sort of competing things are happening inside your brain. This is one of the fields that I've published in, so I'm using this as an example because I know it. And we can create models that replicate this type of behavior, the thing that you're experiencing now, right? With it flipping back and forth. And they are extremely similar to decision-making models where you have to choose between an apple and a banana. Which are you going to have for lunch dessert? Right. So what's really beautiful is you can use the same model, and then it turns out that the model actually applies to many different situations that you thought were really different, but they end up using the same mechanism in the brain. So it can bring things together. It can be very integrated to use these models. Now, this is one thing that I think is very similar to what we just talked about, right? This falsifiability, right? There's no wiggle room. You make a specific prediction based on your model. And if it doesn't pan out, then, trash your model, right? So this is completely different from these verbal theories where people can just sort of weasel out of the conclusions of some experiment, for example. Yeah. So this also means, so I'll get into it a little bit later. So models are also sort of complete, right? You know that if you can replicate the behavior that you're interested in, you have a full description. You also know what might be lacking. If you see that, like in some specific pattern, you really can't replicate yet, but all the other behaviors you can replicate, you know, like over the whole, my model works, but in this specific instances it doesn't. Right? So it gives you a very complete description of what you understand. And the thing that I like best about this sort of thing is once you have the simulation, you've created your own little world. Right? You're the god of the simulation in the computer. Now you can make it do tricks. You can change the parameters of the model, and I'll go into what parameters there might be in a model and that sort of thing. But now that you have a model that you think is a good model, it replicates the behavior that you're interested in, you can start like fiddling around with these things, like, oh, what happens if this parameter changes? Hey, the decision making of the model changes, and that pattern in the decision making looks really a lot like Parkinson's patients. Like that sort of thing you can get then because you have this playground. You can start simulating the model in ways ways that you don't have specific data for. They can be this beautiful intellectual creative tool if you can use it in this way. And this is really something that the people forget this, right? People think like, this is like very drudgery, boring, like math homework sort of thing. But it can be like a beautiful creative tool. Now, there are also weaknesses of models, of course. You need to know a lot before you can make a good model, right? So you just can't get away with sloppiness or with like disregarding whole pieces of literature, that sort of thing. So they place a high demand on the knowledge that you have. The other thing is that computational neuroscience, the field that we're sort of introing here, it's a field, but it's also not really a field, right? If you have this model that applies to perception, but also to decision making, and also to, I don't know, addiction or what have you, all of these things, they have their own fields also. So, yeah, it's not a real field, if you will. It's not very self-contained. It's more of a way of thinking about a specific phenomenon than it is its own field where no one else can touch it. Now, in many cases, knowing your math helps a lot. In many other cases, you don't actually need to know that much math, but if you know the rules, you can recreate them code, then you're already like 90% of the way. Right? And then there's a bunch of shortcuts that you can get if you do know the math, but we're, at least in this course, also not going to function on H1. But it is a relatively technical thing that in many cases requires a bunch of practice. And one thing that's really weird is that everybody makes their models, and this is my baby, and I have this beautiful model. Look at it. Show it to the world in the publication. Really proud of it. This woman's data. The child going to kindergarten. And so everybody's really proud of their own model, their little baby. And then no one wants to look at how well another researcher's model performs, right? So there is a lot of ego involved also in this type of field. So this is in here for you people that are interested in psychology. This is not one of those psychology years, but it is very interesting to have a look at this. Right, so if you're interested in how the brain goes wrong, right, in certain disorders, then models can help. Right, so they help you be critical of the terminology that's used in the field. Right, the vague concepts will not help you understand a brain disorder. You need to be mechanistic in terms of your understanding. So one of these box and arrow diagrams, not so much. Okay? So it's too vague, too abstract. And then the question becomes, can this sort of mechanistic understanding, can it help for clinical cases? And you can imagine that if you're interested in Alzheimer's, aging, cognitive decline, if you have memory models, people are making beautiful memory models, then this allows you to understand the pattern with which the brain sort of degrades over time, like the disorder of Alzheimer's, for example. And similarly, specific fields of AI, like reinforcement learning, they allow an artificial agent to perform a certain type of behavior, and that's specifically the type of behavior that we know is broken in specific diseases, right? Addiction, Parkinson's disease, that sort of thing. Reinforcement learning really allows you to model what's going on in these patients. And then there are beautiful ways of modeling the dynamics of physical systems. And in specific disorders such as epilepsy, it really is sort of the physical behavior of the neurons that's going wrong. So you want to use that type of modeling. So you see, the modeling gives you an entire sort of toolkit, and then you just have to identify what do you need to apply it to. So the idea here is that when we use these models, we hope to gain a deeper understanding of how the brain functions and how disorders of the mind also work. And only then can we really start to, for example, create drugs that really attack a specific thing, like a specific part of the mechanism that we know is going wrong, right? Nowadays, still a lot of brute force, right? Oh, this drug helps because, yeah, something in the 60s, I don't know, right? And then people use it because it works, but there's no real understanding. And the hope is that using this type of modeling allows you to then take this from the top down. Now, you don't just do modeling, right? It's all there's always a goal for a specific field to understand something better. And there's specific types of models that you can use to do different things. So sort of a hierarchy of different types of models. Again, similar to those levels of description, there's different types of models, different ways of thinking about what you want your model to do, how your model works inherently. So there are models where you're modeling data, right? So and you can think of this like a machine learning type thing, right? You're doing like a correlational analysis or a regression analysis, that sort of approach. And this is a more statistical type of model, right? You're modeling the statistical relations between patterns in your data. So you as people that may have taken AI like machine learning courses, you'll be very familiar with this. But this is only one type of model. You can also create more generative models where the model that you have is actually really like a little machine that performs things in the same way that you think the brain is performed. So you really have a model of the process that happens in a specific brain region, or neuron, or in a specific patient population. That's it. So that you can see the difference in what you're trying to do, right? One is very much aimed at data, and the other is really aimed at the process or the mechanism that we're attempting to explain. But again, like those levels of the Marian tree, right? There's a lot of overlap between these things. Like in many cases, you can have a generative model, right? Beautiful mathematical description of how some process might work, but then still you need to fit that model using a data-driven machine learning type approach. And so these things blend together in many ways, but it's important to always, like I said about the Marian levels, you take a step back and you try to realize, what am I trying to do, right? What level am I trying to explain? Now, if you're coming from AI, I just want to give a bit of a historical background. If you look at the 1960s type AI, right, you have these in the 1970s, 80s, these Bayesian networks type of things, and really people talking about generative models. And they're based on abstract ideas. They're going through the rules that you would think the brain should implement. Right? Really at that high Marian level of abstraction, conceptual level. Now, in many cases, these were successful, right? Spam filters and that sort of thing are usually used as these examples of how this type of thing works. There are many more complex things also. But in many cases also, these things couldn't really reach human level performance. So you have these beautiful high level descriptions, but when applied to practice, they become hard. Or they don't really solve the problem in the way that we humans can. Specifically things like computer vision, for example. Turns out that since, AlexNet, we have understood that if we use deep learning, like neural network derived architectures that are much more hungry in terms of the amount of data that you put in and are much bigger in terms of computational complexity, you can sort of use deep learning to really attain very high level performance. Yeah. So in this case, you have a sort of broad architecture, but you don't have a very explicit generative model. you have a lot of parameters to fit, you need a lot of data. And in many cases, what you're doing is you don't really have an overarching abstract idea of the computation that should happen. You just copy the brain's architecture in some meaningful way, and then you make sure that you have a lot of parameters where the fine tuning of the parameters allows the method to solve the problem you're interested in. So one of these is very conceptual. Again, this is one of those, continua, the spectrum, right? So you can be on one side where you're very conceptual, like in the old AI digs, you want to have a very high level conceptual understanding, and the other one is very low level and very much brute force. But this is a pendulum. If you look at the literature, it goes back and forth and back and forth. And we are now in, let's say, the autumn of the neural network revolution. And you can feel in the way that people are talking about this in the field that we're at this level where deep neural networks and transformers and what have you are really good at specific tasks, but we're also very much starting to identify where they are not at human levels of performance. And so it's exactly those types of conceptual, high-level knowledge types of things where these models are not performing the way that we do, at least. So this is a pendulum that's going to swing back. Right? We're going to need more conceptual, abstract, high-level types of AI at some point. And so this state of the field at a very sort of global level, where is the science going, is really something that you'll get from the podcasts. So I really recommend you listen to a couple of different podcasts so that you get an idea for, what are the things that people are really anticipating for future research. So that's specifically what we'll focus on also in this course. Right? So I'll give you a bit of the fundamentals, and then I hope that you'll gain your own view on where the field is going. And so based on your own interests also, you'll see that some of the researchers are really interested in how children, for example, learn the structure of the world. It's a very beautiful new field of AI, very much child psychology oriented. And you'll read one or two papers about that too. So I'm really hoping that you can really sort of pick and choose, really at the end of the course, what is your specific field of interest and what do you find most interesting? And you can really get an idea for where the field is going. What is the stage right there? So I also want to say that I hope, so this course, I feel always when I teach it, I have to really pick and choose a few topics. There's like many different lectures that I would love to give. And so this course would easily, in my book, be twice as long. I would love that, but it's not. And so if you're interested in these topics, I really recommend a few sort of follow-up courses. So one is that this Paul Middlebrooks, the creator of the podcast that you'll be listening to, so you'll hear him interview people. He's actually created this Neuro AI course. I think it's like $100 to get access to it. So if you want to do that, it's not that much of a layout. So I've heard really, really good stories about this, and it overlaps in large part with these with what we're doing in this course, but not fully. So I definitely recommend, if you're interested in this, go check it out. And every summer, there's this computational cognitive neuroscience summer school called NeuroMatch Academy. There's actually two. One of them is computational neuroscience, and the other is deep learning. And so they're separate courses. They are, I think, 2 or 3 weeks, and they are like, I think there's like more content to that course. It's much more practical. It's like really very intense. But after 3 weeks, you could just roll into a PhD program. I actually have all of my PhDs. I'm forcing them to take this NeuroMatch Academy. So they're like, if you're really interested in this type of topic, then check it out. They're very, very cool. And yeah, I wish this course were more like that one. Which may not be the best thing to say about your own course, but you get the point. So we're going to first in this course model behavior. Yeah. So we're going to focus on very, very simple types of behavior, choice processes, that sort of thing, and take it from there. So the simplest thing is to ground things in overt behavior. And that's what we'll start with. So in the first few weeks, we're going to do that. And the first practical is also that. How do we model simple behavior? And that gives you an idea of how can we simplify what the brain is doing. Yeah. Now then, I'll go into, from a historical perspective, go into the basics of artificial neural networks, and then specifically using neural networks as models of the human brain, really trying to look at this interaction between the human brain, what we know about how the human brain works, and these artificial neural networks. Because there's a lot of inspiration going back and forth. Right? If you look at a convolutional neural network, it looks, in terms of its architecture, exactly like what we know the visual system of the brain does. And that is not like a happenstance thing. That is by design, right? It is people from AI just co-opting what they knew from how the brain works. And at the same time, AI is going so fast that you're going to get a lot of ideas coming from AI that might be models of how the brain works. We don't know, right? And so that interplay is going to be a really big part of sort of the second half of the course. So, I should have clicked earlier. And so that really is the what we're aiming for. Trying to understand how can cognitive neuroscience benefit AI, and how can AI benefit cognitive neuroscience, and all of the things that you'll read, you should see in that light. So we'll work towards these things like how is AI used as a tool, right, in cognitive neuroscience? Because it is, and people are doing that more and more, like just a neural network as part of an analysis pipeline, for example. So that happens more and more. And that can be very, very telling. And the other is, AI is sort of started developing on its own. Yeah, it's like, it really has like it's like a rocket ship, right? It's flown off into outer space. There's so much power in that in space for developing new methods. They really don't care anymore about whether what they're producing has anything to do with the brain. But there might be these nuggets of knowledge that come from that, like these types of processing that really work well in an artificial neural network. And then we can decide, hey, maybe this is a good model of how the brain is. So these two directions are the things that I'm interested in teaching. Yeah. One other thing is, and I haven't actually explicitly talked about this right now. A model is a toy. Right? Very important. When people say I have a toy model, it's always good because they're not like this is my baby. So, right? All models are wrong. It means that because your model is a simplified version of reality, it's always going to have its limits. All models are at some point wrong. You start throwing specific types of data at it that it was not designed for, it's going to produce wrong predictions. Yeah. Also, I have to always keep that in mind. I'll talk a bit more about that in later course, later lectures. I think we're about good. I don't want to keep you too long for those of you that are going to have to go into math class in 10 minutes or so. Yeah, I hope to see you all Friday morning. That lecture is going to be 2 floors down. I will post the exact room number later today. So I'll see you all on Friday, I hope. Yeah, great.